We are finally starting on the weapon type ranking videos. Gonna go through every single one of these and rank all of the weapons inside of their own categories from worst to best based on how useful and how well they perform in PvE. We're just gonna start off with the daggers and work our way down. But yes, for today, there are going to be 18 daggers in total that we are going to be ranking. And as I always say about the daggers, they tend to be outclassed by a lot of other small and quicker types of weapons. Things like straight swords and curved swords that it's going to be much more reliable in terms of the range, DPS, stagger potential, and even stance damage. And if you're going to be power stancing them, there is like almost no reason to use daggers over claws, as the claw weapons just do more damage, gets bleed, also gets really high crit damage, gets much shorter animations, and just much higher DPS. Unfortunately, they are just outclassed, but they still are going to be viable, and there are plenty of really good options on this list. So if you are looking to make a dagger build, hopefully this video helps you out. Starting off at the bottom at number 18, the Ivory Sickle. Now, some weapons in this game just exist for the sake of existing, and this is just one of them. I have no idea what is even going on here. It is just a terrible weapon through and through. It gets some of the worst damage out of all of the daggers, with basically the exact same moveset. Does get a slightly bit different heavy attack that's still very mediocre. It also gets like a terrible dexterity and intelligence-based scaling, and there are just other types of intelligence-based daggers in this game like the Glintstone KRIS and the Crystal Knife that just get better scalings and more damage. Also, the only thing that makes the daggers unique in some aspects is going to be its critical damage, and this thing just only gets 100 critical, so it just makes this one useless, especially because it only gets Quick Step as its skill, and it cannot be infused, which Quick Step is fine, but like you can put Quick Step on any weapon. If it's a weapon that cannot be infused, it should have a unique one. But I think worst of all yet, it requires smithing stones. I don't know why this weapon cannot be infused and requires smithing stones. Like, this thing is the epitome of doo-doo trash. Number 17, the CELEBRANT'S Sickle. It's just your average dagger with average damage, average range and weights and everything like that. It can be infused. So basically, there's no reason to use this over like the better types of daggers that can be infused in this game, especially because it only gets 100 critical damage. But the entire gimmick of this weapon is that it gives you runes for every single hit, but it's only 10 runes for every single hit. And they thought that this was such a broken mechanic that they decided to make this thing have a 0.5% drop rate. Like, you're gonna have to farm for this thing forever just to get it to drop, and the only benefit that you gain is 10 runes for every single hit. Like, even if this thing was like 200 runes per hit, it still wouldn't even be that useful. There are plenty of really overpowered rune farming methods in this game that you can access pretty early on. This thing just ain't it. I don't know why they had to make this like a gimmick type of weapon, but just make the performance of the weapon just terrible. Number 16, the Crystal Knife. This weapon is just a direct upgrade to the Ivory Sickle, which is definitely not saying much because that weapon is just awful. It's a split intelligence, split magic type of weapon. It does actually get you a B scaling in intelligence, so thankfully it does have some decent scalings, but the damage output is still not going to be good at all. It still only gets 100 critical, doesn't get 110. I don't know why all daggers just don't get 110, that's just silly. It still cannot be infused and you get stuck with Quick Step. Why didn't it have a really cool and unique type of skill? I don't know. And just like the Ivory Sickle, it requires smithing stones. Why does it require smithing stones if we cannot infuse it? I'll never understand. If you did want a really good magic intelligence-based dagger, the Glintstone KRIS is the only option. Number 15, the MAIN-GAUCHE. It actually is a new DLC weapon, and it is one of like the 10 infusible daggers in this game, and it just gets average damage and just gets 110 crit. So as a primary option, there are just going to be much better options out there, but the whole purpose of this weapon is that it can be power stance with thrusting swords. It cannot be power stance with a regular dagger. By pairing it with a thrusting sword is going to give you that power stancing and dual wielding moveset, which one, you're going to have the range and damage of a dagger, but have the moveset of a thrusting sword, which is just slower. It's still going to be pretty quick, but you're going to benefit much more of having a regular thrusting sword. And I don't even like the thrusting sword power sense combos like that. I'd much rather have them two-handed. But the entire benefit of having this paired alongside thrusting swords is to be able to parry alongside with it. You can parry with thrusting swords, but the parry frames are really small, where this one actually does have slightly improved parry frames. So basically that's its entire use. If you wanted to power stance thrusting swords, but you also wanted to parry as well, then this is going to be the option for you. Like, it is going to be viable, and it might be pretty fun to use. But optimally speaking, it's just not going to be good damage in terms of a power sensing combo. It's not going to give you like the best parry, and you're probably not going to get the best critical damage either. Which if you do use the rapier, it is pretty good, but it's not going to get more damage than like a Misericorde if you wanted to go with a parrying build. So basically the entire purpose of this weapon is just for aesthetic, because outside of that, there's not really much of a reason to use it. Number 14, the Great Knife. Now, this is one of 3 different bleed-based daggers in this game. This one actually is going to be your better dexterity-based option. Actually does get better scalings across multiple different types of infusions. A popular pairing might be with an occult infusion, which it does get an A scaling. So it actually can net you the highest amount of bleed buildup out of all the daggers, but it's not going to be by much. It'd be like a couple more points into bleed if you compare it to like a Bloodstained dagger. And the Bloodstained dagger just gets way more damage. So that one is just going to be the better option. Like the Bloodstained dagger does scale better with strength, where this one does scale better with dexterity. So it still has its own specific use, but if you did want to use like a bleed dagger type of build and probably have something to pair alongside the Reduvia, the Great Knife might be your option because it does have similar scalings with an occult infusion. And honestly, you can pair the Great Knife alongside Bloodblade to just get more damage than the Reduvia, but the Bloodstained dagger just does that better anyway. Number 13, the Fire Knight's Shortsword, which is the second of the new DLC daggers in this game. Now, this dagger actually does get split fire damage, also gets a faith scaling, and can be infused. So going into this faith type of build is going to make the most sense. Going with a Flame Art infusion is just going to net you really high amounts of damage. But I think the best part about the weapon is going to be its heavy attack. It does get a nice little double swipe, which is the same as all the other faith-based daggers in this game. And this attack makes the daggers a lot better in my opinion, because you can just spam the uncharged version and the fully charged version all the time and not even have to use a light attacks, and you'll get a much better version of a weapon, and you'll just get a much better version of a dagger. Now, the unfortunate thing is that there is no reason to use this over the ERDSTEEL dagger. The ERDSTEEL dagger can obviously be acquired much earlier in the game. Same range, same weight, does get a bit less base damage, but it just gets pure physical damage, does also get a split faith scaling. And the reason why that is important is that when you do go into these elemental types of infusions, like Flame Art, going into the faith stat also boosts your physical damage as well. So with these faith type of infusions, where the Fire Knight's Shortsword will excel, the ERDSTEEL dagger just does way better. It just gets way more damage with the same type of infusions, and the fact that it's not split fire damage means you can go back and forth between a Sacred and Fire Art infusion and benefit just as much. And with how many more Holy Weak enemies there are in the DLC, it just makes the ERDSTEEL dagger even better. So I think the Fire Knight Shortsword needed like a unique skill to have on the weapon, because the way it stands right now, it's just directly outclassed by the ERDSTEEL dagger. Number 12, the Parrying dagger. It is just a regular dagger with average damage. It's not going to be that good as a primary option, but the entire purpose of this dagger is that it will net you some more parry frames if you do go with a parrying type of skill, which parrying in this game can be pretty good against a lot of different types of bosses, but the majority of enemies in this game cannot be parried, so it is going to be very situational. Especially because stance breaking builds can just offer very similar benefits and is probably going to be better against most types of enemies, even the ones that can be parried, because sometimes it just takes multiple parries just to benefit. But as for the Parrying dagger, its only use is just if you wanted to power stance daggers, have like the Misericorde in your main hand, and if you did like the dual wielding dagger moveset, then you could just throw the Parrying dagger in the offhand and just start parrying and riposting. And being that it is very niche, you might as well just go with Carrying Retaliation on a shield, as that is just going to be much better of a parrying option, and you could just switch back and forth and have like a higher damaging dagger in your offhand instead with like an actual damaging type of skill. It's probably just going to be much more reliable that way, but the Parrying dagger does make it a bit more convenient. Number 11, the Scorpion Stinger, one of the coolest looking daggers in the game, and for some reason they decided against making a unique skill. Like, they put so much effort into the actual design. Why not give it a unique skill? But this thing is a dexterity based dagger that cannot be infused, and it does get passive rot buildup. Now, Scarlet Rot is pretty powerful. Now, this version is going to be the weaker version of Scarlet Rot at only the 15% damage over the 90 seconds, which if you're using things like spells or the hefty rot pots, those things are going to be doing 30% rot buildup instead. Now, the annoying thing about Scarlet Rot, specifically with the weapons, is that they don't scale with anything, so you're always going to be stuck with the same amount of buildup. And for the weapons, they typically only get like 50 rot buildup, so it takes like 8 to 10 hits sometimes just to be able to proc the rot. So I don't think this thing would even be that viable as a secondary option. If you do spam its skill Repeating Thrust, you could be able to proc rot a bit faster. And Repeating Thrust is a pretty decent skill, but it's not the best thing to have on a dagger. You're going to notice that you're going to miss a whole bunch. Like, this thing just needed to have a unique Scarlet Rot skill to maybe proc rot a lot faster, maybe just make it do a lot more damage when rot is proc. Like, daggers typically serve as nice secondary options because they're really light, get high crit damage. So it would have been nice if this thing had a really quick way to proc rot with its skill, or give you like a passive effect to do more damage after rotting, because it would have paired really nicely with a lot of different types of dexterity builds. But unfortunately, we got mid. Number 10, the WAKIZASHI. Now, this dagger is actually going to be the highest damaging dagger in the game in terms of its base damage, and it also does get passive bleed as well, which is very nice. So as a primary option, it might be one of the better daggers. Now, as I did mention, daggers are going to be outclassed by things like curved swords or straight swords. If you did want to have like a two-handing option, those things are just going to perform way better. Now, it could be decent as a power stancing option, but the thing is with the WAKIZASHI, it cannot be power stance with other daggers, and its entire gimmick is to be power stance with a katana. but it's definitely not going to be as good as like regular power stance katanas, as you're still going to have the range and the damage of a regular dagger, but have the slower movesets of a katana. And the katana power stance combos don't hit simultaneously, so I don't really typically care for them that much. I much rather have katanas one-handed or two-handed. But the whole reason why you would want to have the wakizashi in your offhand with a katana is to be able to parry with it, because katanas don't get parry as a skill, but daggers do. So if you wanted to go with like a parrying type of katana build, you could just use the wakizashi and it could work nicely. So the entire thing is just going to be based on aesthetic, because it's not going to be that viable, especially because it only gets 100 crits. So it's not like you can get a stance break then switch to the wakizashi to get higher crit damage. It's not going to work that way. So it has some things going for it, and it does have some like unique interactions with the katanas, but that one interesting factor that it does have is very niche. Number 9, the CINQUEDEA. The only purpose of this dagger is to be able to just have it boost your bestial incantations by 10%. You can just have it in your main hand, in like 2 hands the claw mark seal, and you can just get a lot more damage out of your bestial incantations, which for the most part, they don't tend to be that good. Beast Claw and Stone Rank are pretty nice, but they're not going to be anywhere near as the best projectile options in the game. So inherently, this weapon that's going to boost those incantations is not going to be that useful, especially because the weapon itself is not that good. It is the heaviest dagger in the game at 3.5 units. It does get some decent damage, but you can't buff it, can't infuse it. It gets stuck with Quick Step. I don't know why this thing didn't get a cool and unique skill. That would have been nice. It does only get 100 critical as well. So like using this as a primary option is just not it. The whole purpose is just to boost the bestial incantations. Number 8, the regular dagger. Now, as I mentioned, daggers are really good secondary options because they're really light and they have high critical damage, and the dagger does get 130 crit. Now, if you want to go with a critical attack build, the Misericorde is still going to be the better option, as that one does get more damage and get 140 crit, and that one can be acquired almost just as early in the game. So it kind of just makes the regular dagger obsolete in that area. But the main reason why I'm going to value the dagger at least this much is because it's the lightest dagger in the game with the lowest requirements. So you can just treat this as like a buffing L2 stick. If you want to use things like Golden Bow Ash of War, just slap it onto a dagger. Before every single boss fight, you can just use the skill, gain a bunch more damage. You don't have to upgrade it. It's going to work with every build because it has really low requirements. And you could do that exact same thing with a lot of different types of Ashes of War. You can use things like Chilling Mist and proc Frost at the start of the boss fight. You could even use things like Shared Order or Sacred Order to do more damage with your spells or more damage against undead. You could also use it for Assassin's Gambit as a nice stealth-based option. Like if you want to use all of these different types of skills that don't require an upgraded weapon, the dagger is the best option for that. Number 7, the Blade of Calling, which is a really nice dexterity and faith-based dagger. Does get the cool, unique, heavy attack that the other faith-based daggers get, and a nice double swipe that actually can output some nice damage. And in terms of its skill, it is a very solid projectile. It does actually net you infinite hype armor, can go pretty far, has a nice horizontal spread, and it can send smaller enemies flying. Now, I think it's an amazing skill, and this can just destroy a lot of different enemies and bosses in this game. Now, the only reason why I don't really care to use it is because the Black Knife exists, and this is basically the exact same thing. Very similar scalings, similar damage, same moveset, same range. And the weapon skill is basically the exact same animation, but it just does a destined death damage over time effect instead. So it can just do way more damage, especially against these bosses with large amounts of health. And you get that one much earlier in the game, so it kind of just makes the Blade of Calling obsolete. But I wouldn't say it's useless because its skill is a bit cheaper, and it actually does send smaller enemies flying, where the Black Knife doesn't knock them back to the ground. So it could be pretty useful in some cases of the game, but for me personally, I would never really use it over the Black Knife. Number 6, the Bloodstained Dagger. Now, out of all the blade-based daggers that can be infused, this is the best amongst them, as it does just get the most amount of damage. It gets the same moveset, same 110 crit multiplier, but it's just going to hit harder with basically every single infusion. Now, if you are going to go into an occult type of build, the Great Knife can get a little bit more bleed buildup, but it's not that noticeable. And with daggers, you can actually equip some pretty decent skills like Bloodblade, and you could potentially just get a better version of the Reduvia. But if you wanted to use Bloodblade, things like curved swords and katanas exist, and those are just going to pair much better with Bloodblade. And if you did want to power stance with a Bloodstained Dagger, it's not going to be anywhere near as good as things like Claws or Power Stance Scavenger's Curve Sword. Those are going to be much more consistent and just output way higher DPS. But there are going to be some skills in the game like Bloody Slash, which this skill is kind of like a projectile attack. It doesn't actually get a hitbox at closer range, and it's going to do just as much damage with a dagger as it would like a katana. And you could just pair this alongside a Bloodstained Dagger, because it is really light. And you could just pair this alongside the Bloodstained Dagger with an occult infusion. So that might be a pretty decent option. It is very viable, but as I've been mentioning, I don't really care much for daggers as primary options. Number 5, the Reduvia, which is an amazing weapon in this game. It can shred and destroy so many different bosses, and a lot of people might put this at number 1. Now, for all of my ranking lists, they're based on usefulness, and the Reduvia, I don't consider it to be that useful because the Bloodblade Ash of War exists, and that one is just better, and let me explain. Now, the Reduvia cannot be infused. It gets a nice dexterity and arcane scaling. Also gets very high amounts of bleed buildup, even more so than the other daggers with high amounts of arcane with an occult infusion. And its weapon skill, Bloodblade, is a high damaging bleed attack that can proc bleed very quickly, go relatively far for not that much FP. Now, the animation of this is basically identical to Bloodblade. Now, the differences being is that Bloodblade does take away a little bit of your health for the first initial cast. Every other successive cast doesn't drain health, but just the first one does, because you do actually have to cut your hand first, which does make it have a slight bit longer animation. But Bloodblade can just do more damage, consume half the amount of FP, and just consume a lot less stamina as well. And I think the best part about Bloodblade is that you can put it on things like a curved sword or a katana. And being that when using the skill, the weapon also gets a hitbox, you're going to be doing way more damage at these closer ranges, and it's going to be more consistent too, because things like curved swords and katanas just have more range. So at these closer distances, using a Bloodblade katana just performs way better than the Reduvia. Now, it's not to say that the Reduvia is useless, because as I mentioned, it doesn't drain your health. So at lower levels, it's not going to be that big of a deal, whereas for the 40 health penalty that the Bloodblade skill does give, might be very noticeable early game, but once you get later on, it's basically a non-issue. And the fact that it doesn't drain health means that it's going to have better synergy with the Ritual Sword Talisman, but even with the Ritual Sword Talisman, Bloodblade still does more damage. And also, Reduvia Bloodblade does scale of AR, whereas Bloodblade only scales of Arcane. So when you add these really high levels of Dexterity and Arcane, the Reduvia can actually get more damage. Unless you're hitting with a katana at closer range, then it's never going to do more damage. And also, Reduvia Bloodblade does get a little bit more bleed buildup. It's not that noticeable. I tested it out at 60 Arcane. An Occult Nagakiba can get you about 350 bleed buildup, where the Reduvia gets you about 380. So it's still a very viable weapon. It's still very useful. I would just rather go with a Bloodblade katana because you're going to have a better weapon type, going to get way more range, more damage, do more stance damage, and it's consume a lot less stamina, which is pretty annoying about the Reduvia. You can't really spam it as much as you would like, but it is still a great weapon and you will find plenty of success with it. Number 4, the ERDSTEEL dagger. Now, if you wanted a primary option for a dagger, I think this one is just the best one, as it can just do the most amount of damage and just get the best moveset too. Now, as I mentioned with the Fire Knight shortsword, it basically performs the exact same way. Gets the same range, weight, same moveset, does get a split faith scaling and can be infused, but this one does get pure physical damage, so when going into a faith-based infusion like Flame Art or Sacred, you actually benefit off more physical damage as well as elemental damage when going into the faith stat, and it can just result in really high amounts of AR. And with how good that heavy attack is, both uncharged or fully charged, it can just melt so many different enemies in this game. And this weapon has just gotten even better in the DLC due to things like Flame Spear. This Ash of War is a really nice damaging projectile that does scale off faith and buff the weapon with even more fire damage. I just consider it to be a much more consistent version of Flaming Strike. And also in the DLC, there are a lot of different bosses that are really weak to holy damage, and with these weapons that can be infused, you can just go back and forth between Flame Art and Sacred. So obviously it just grants amazing versatility. So yes, if you haven't used the ERDSTEEL dagger before, I recommend that you do. Number 3, the Misericorde, which is probably the best critical damage weapon in the entire game. It might not beat out things like the Executioner's Great Axe in terms of damage, but based on usefulness, the Misericorde is going to be the best one because it is a dagger, so it's going to be really light and have really low requirements, and it can just pair nicely with every single type of build because it can be infused. But yes, this thing does get 140 crit, does get some of the highest base damage out of the daggers, and also does get that poking attack moveset with those heavy attacks. But the main use of the Misericorde is just going to be for those parry riposting type of builds, or if you're going to go with a stance breaking build, you can just switch to the Misericorde and just get the riposte and it result in monstrous amounts of damage. Doesn't matter what build that you have, faith build, magic build, dexterity, strength, just have this infused into one of those stats. And any single time you get a parry or a stance break, just switch to the Misericorde. It might not be like the most convenient thing in the world, but you're going to benefit off so much more damage. Number 2, the Black Knife. Now, as I mentioned with the Blade of Calling, this is basically the exact same thing. Another faith dexterity weapon. Does get the 110 crit, the same double swiping heavy attack, which you should just be using this all the time. Like, I wouldn't even bother using the light attacks unless you had really small openings, but it's using the uncharged and fully charged heavy attacks are just amazing. But the best part about the weapon is going to be its skill, which is a nice damaging projectile attack. goes pretty far, only consumes 25 FP, does amazing damage, and has a nice horizontal spread, so enemies that like to dodge and move around, they're probably still going to get hit by it. And best of all yet, it gets infinite hype armor. You're like never going to get staggered out of it as soon as you click the attack, and it does do that destined death damage over time effect, so against bosses with larger amounts of health, it's just going to destroy them. And the fact that it is doing holy damage is just amazing, especially as of the DLC, due to a lot of enemies now being weak to holy damage, and things like the Sword of Light and Sword of Darkness just make it a lot better too. But even if you didn't like daggers as a primary option, you could just still use this as a secondary option. With any single type of faith build, you can just have this in your back pocket, then just switch to it and spam the skill, and a lot of bosses are going to get deleted. Number 1, the Glintstone KRIS, which is just busted. It's a dexterity and intelligence based dagger, does get the 110 crit, but its skill, Glintstone Dart, is just insane. It's a buffed up version of Glintstone Pebble, as it does just go further and do more damage. Does also get the same follow-up lunging poking attack, and the entire combo can melt enemies pretty quickly. But what makes the skill broken is when you have it fully charged, because it turns the projectile attack into like a comet based attack, and it just goes so much further and it does stupid amounts of damage and only consumes 10 FP. Like, this is one of the most efficient projectiles in the entire game, because this thing can outdamage things like Knight's Comet or regular Comet with the Carrying Regal Scepter at higher amounts of intelligence. Like, this thing could just do more damage and only consume 10 FP and be in the form of a very small and light dagger that does not get high requirements at all. Now, it is unfortunate that it is a dagger because it's not going to perform as well as other types of smaller and quicker dexterity weapons in terms of their moveset, but you don't really need to use any other attack anyway. Just keep spamming the projectile attack over and over again and everything just dies. It might make for a boring experience, but it doesn't change the fact that it's probably the most broken dagger in the game. Okay, that is the ranking now complete. As always, let me know what your opinions are in the comments below. Now, the next one might be ranking the straight swords. I'm just going to go down in order of which the game recognizes the categories. So if you are interested in seeing any of these things ranked, definitely do subscribe for that. And also do follow me on Twitch as well. I do a bunch of challenge runs every single day. So if you did want to see those or ask me a bunch of questions, just give me a follow there. And I'll catch you guys around. Bye.